The news travels. The world begins to be in a state of shock, fearing a possible devastating return of a war, which the world has experienced twice in the past. What is missing for this to happen from today? Well, however, what is happening between Russia and Ukraine? The chances of a third war occurring is null for now. According to some data captured by the news, referring to the response of US President Joe Biden, saying that he would not send armed troops to Ukraine, you can understand that she is preventing it from becoming something worse. He said that a world war would only start if Americans and Russians started shooting at each other. I particularly believe that there will not be a direct conflict between Russia and the United States. Still, it depends a lot on the path to be taken by the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin. Perhaps the issue is not the probability of there being a world war. Rather, there could even be a war, but cybernetically speaking, as is what happened a few days ago, where an anonymous hacker group declared war against Russia, but not at the world. And if there were to be a war involving armaments, it could be ended without even a shot being fired. But if this shot were fired, awakening all the countries involved worldwide, we well know the chaos that will ensue afterwards, if not finished. That if there are survivors to tell the story. I say this because of the current war power of the countries. I'm not just referring to the big ones, but I'm talking about the small countries too, which somehow have acquired some military technology, so they don't stay at the mercy of old equipment outside the current military context. If we look at it, just as the big countries have grown immensely in military infrastructure, the small ones have also proportionally followed this growth. So adding up all the global military war power, we can say that it is almost 100% greater than what was used in the last World War. Okay, one may be exaggerating a little, since old weapons are very well used nowadays. And they do damage. But this increase in armaments started with the Cold War, where the biggest superpowers world countries, Russia and the United States, were at war with each other, I say coldly, to arm themselves to the teeth in order to protect their own country. Okay, but what would happen to the world if these superpowers decided to use 100% of their equipment deadly? Better saying, let's put small countries on the board too. Thus, the beginning of a 3 degrees world war. We could assume that some leaders with great global influences would have to accept their ignorance, and thus start the same conflict that started 83 years ago and lasted about 6 years and 1 day. Well, how long this supposed third war would last, we don't know. Let's just stay in our imaginations. Let's also assume that the first weapons to be used would be nuclear bombs. The first conclusion that we could draw from this assumption is that millions of lives would be taken, and that would not even be a face-to-face fight, but a distant war, where each army would be in its own territory, using its nuclear weapons, which has a devastating power of destruction. Oh, comes the question that whoever hits the opponent first would have an absurd advantage, because the country which received the bomb, it would be devastated for several kilometers, or even completely. With the use of these nuclear bombs, we can work this video in two hypotheses. Is a nuclear winter happening or not? Which is feared by all. Perhaps you have already heard that the world would be in chaos. The skies would darken. The sun's rays would not be able to penetrate the layer of smoke and soot left by the excess explosions of nuclear bombs. A radioactive rain would begin, due to the chemical elements compounded in the pump. And without sunlight, plants would not be able to make the process of transforming carbon dioxide and water into glucose, a phenomenon known as photosynthesis. Not to mention that seconds after the explosions, a few kilometers of vegetables would be devastated, both by the impact and by radioactivity. We will talk more about this, and how as a result, herbivorous animals would not have their respective food and would end up starving. I mean the survivors. This is valid for the entire animal food classification. Carnivores, which depend on the meat of other animals, and omnivores that depend on the plant and of meat to eat. And if after all these events, there are some human beings surviving, they would be without vegetables, without meat to eat. We can even say, without water too. Because if the bomb exploded in direct contact with the ground, it would contaminate the entire territory, and also the rivers and lakes close by, and that would make the waters unusable. And with that, in all the ways that the human being tried to survive, he would die, because the lack of resources for a constancy of life would not exist. Another hypothesis of a not much better future is if there was no nuclear winter. Sometime after the explosion, the smoke and soot would be dispersed. The sun would rise again. With time the vegetables would start to grow. Maybe not in color green as we know it, but in opaque, lifeless tones. Yellowish and reddish tones. But that with time would normalize in the natural color as we know. We can have as a reference the current green forests that grow in the old Chernobyl nuclear power plant, that occupy the entire territory there. The animals that survived the explosion would be able to feed themselves, and consequently, multiply. I mean the animals that endured the levels of radiation left by the bomb. But these animals would not be normal, as they would carry in their bodies radioactive components, which would cause some deficiencies, and with that shorter lifespan. The worst part would be for human survivors, because they could not feed on the animals, because they were contaminated. Nor could they quench their thirst, because the waters would also be contaminated, and they would also carry radioactivity in their bodies. And as a consequence, deficiencies, shorter lifespan, and even knowing of all the impossibilities to survive, the human being would try. and with the lack of non-contaminating resources, maybe a possible cannibalism could happen. The question remains. Survival instinct would speak louder, even knowing the risks. Maybe you're wondering why I mentioned radioactivity. Well, nuclear bombs carry radioactive elements in their compounds. For example, the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki contained uranium-235, plutonium-239. Fraction of seconds after the explosion, gamma rays were released, neutrons and X-rays at a distance of 3 kilometers. The consequences were devastating, with the explosions of these two bombs. In addition to thousands of people dead, many were injured and suffering from diseases that radiation provided. Unlike the Chernobyl plant, Hiroshima and Nagasaki are habitable because the level of radioactivity was much lower than that of the nuclear plant. Because the bombs were detonated before reaching the ground, so all the radioactive material went to the atmosphere through a mushroom formed by the explosion. While in Chernobyl the radiation spread through the ground, and in greater amounts, making rehab impossible. Anyway, in all the hypotheses I mentioned, humanity would be lost, because at the end of all they would result in deaths. But of course, there are other possible speculations that could be elaborated. Maybe some human beings, protecting themselves in bunkers with a large food stocks. Would they live until the food ran out? Going to isolated places far from the blast area? That if they can, because the explosion area of a bomb is gigantic. This seems to be the most unlikely of all, but who knows, considerations for this is not what is lacking nowadays. Anyway, a third war would make the world regress in infrastructure and technology for a few centuries. It's the same thing as if you went back a few years, when no technology existed. Only in a worse way, because nations would be devastated by war. And for that several governments could rise up and stabilize again as countries, and become what they are today, would take many years. We can conclude this video using a phrase said by Albert Einstein. I don't know what the Third World War will be like, but one know what the fourth one will be like, with stones and sticks.